Hey guys, so today's lecture is going to be pretty short. That's because when I made the syllabus, I didn't remember quite how long the Introduction to Memory section is. Turns out it's pretty darn short. I normally pair it with my next section on memory, but we're going to stick with the syllabus and plug ahead. So we're going to talk about sort of the basic principle of how memory operates. So memory is amazing because it's what enables us to know who people are. If there was no memory, everyone you would meet would be a stranger. You would never, you'd never know how to cook because you would never remember how to do certain things. It would just be miserable. So memory is essentially the way that we know that learning has occurred. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier when we were looking at conditioning. Well, memory is the outcome of conditioning. Now, there are lots of other ways to learn. I'm not saying that everything learned is through conditioning, but what I am saying is that the outcome is the same thing as learning. So the outcome is something that persists over time that becomes what's known as a memory. So how are memories stored? Well, not like you might think. So everybody thinks, okay, I have this memory and I can just play it out in my head. Well, if you know anything about the, the dream research and the mind reading research, both of which there's very little out there of, what we find is that that's not how memory is stored, and we can't just replay someone's memories. There are certain memories, however, that operate in a similar fashion. These memories are known as flashbulb memories. So a flashbulb memory is a unique, typically very emotionally charged memory. And these memories they're called flashbulb memories because it's like something goes off in your brain and you remember it very powerfully. So, some of the key flashbulb memories in my life would be, Princess Diana dying. I remember exactly where I was when I found out. I was in a chat room, believe it or not, at like 2 o'clock in the morning. I was in like middle school. No idea what I was doing on a chat room at 2 o'clock in the morning, but I was. And that's a flashbulb memory. Another one is like, for instance, 9/11. Most of us probably have some sort of a flashbulb memory, a really powerful memory. But it doesn't just happen with world events. Flashbulb memories are basically any memory that is powerfully charged with emotion. So this is part of why we have so much trouble believing people that say that they have no memory of an event that was clearly very stressful. Because generally speaking, more powerful emotions lead to more powerful memories. And these memories are flashbulb memories. The problem, though, is that flashbulb memories, like all memories, are susceptible to decay over time, but in addition to that, they can also be introduced with errors from the very start. So flashbulb memories are not free from error. Let me give you an example. For decades, Ulrich Nesser would tell the story of how he heard of the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. He would explain that he heard it from a news bulletin that interrupted a radio broadcast of a baseball game. Does anyone know the problem with this? Well, if you're a baseball fan, it's pretty clear to you. Baseball doesn't happen in December. It must have been a different sport. So the baseball season ends in November. Clearly there were no games playing when the Pearl Harbor attack occurred. So what's going on with Ulrich? Well, it turns out that Ulrich Nesser is a huge baseball fan. And so as a result of that experience that he has, his brain likes to put together information that makes sense. Now, whatever sport he was listening to was an unusual sport for him to listen to. He didn't listen to that sport as much as he listened to the baseball games. So his brain said, nah, that doesn't fit because we never do that, so I'm just going to tell you right now that was actually a baseball game. So this is part of how these memories get decayed or get entered erroneously. So let's look at the stages of memory, and we're going to look at 2 different models and figure out where these errors can occur. So the most simple model says that we have encoding, then we store it, and then we retrieve it. Simple as that. So you put the information in, typing it on your keyboard, you press the save button, and it stores to your computer. And then later on when you want the information, you click around and then it comes up on your monitor and you retrieve it. So you're going to find throughout the next couple of lectures where we discuss memory that we're going to use a computer metaphor a lot. And that's because the computer metaphor is very helpful in understanding how our brains operate. Now, let's look at this model of memory in a little bit more depth. We're going to look at the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. This is known as the three-stage model of memory formation. So what happens is, first, there is some sort of external event, right? And we interpret this external event through our senses. So this is what goes into what's known as sensory memory. So sensory memory is touch, sight, sound, smell, and sound. Or rather, I'm sorry. But anyway, so the sensory memories are based off of your 5 main senses. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that some of the sensory memories actually have a slight delay and can lead to some entertaining outcomes. So I'm sure that you've been all guilty of this at some point in your life, where somebody says something, and then you say, wait, what did you say? And then as they're saying it, or even before they're saying it, you remember what it is. So this is a delay from the phonological loop, which we're going to learn about in a couple of lectures, that maybe the next lecture, I'm not sure. But it's a delay. So sensory memory sometimes has a delay. Now, the information goes into sensory memory, and depending on whether or not you attend to it, then it goes through encoding, and as it's being encoded, it moves into the short-term memory. Now, your short-term memory enables you to remember bits of information for a relatively short amount of time. A perfect example would be a phone number, right? If someone says a phone number to you, generally speaking, you can remember it long enough to write it down. Now, if I were to ask you, hey, what was that phone number I gave you 3 weeks ago? You'd be less likely to be able to remember that information. That's because it only goes through the earliest level of encoding, moving it over to this short-term, what's known as working memory. Now, if the information becomes important, then you will then move it over through additional encoding to the long-term memory. The long-term memory sits over here, and whenever you need to recall the information again, you simply pull it out of your long-term memory and into that short-term working memory. So I mentioned that attention is very important. Attention is what enables you to know what information you need to encode. So if you look at this picture right down here, you look at it without having looked at these other 2 pictures over there, you might not notice this guy right here in this plaid shirt. But when you zoom in and you see him and everything like that, if you pay enough attention to that information, you're going to encode it. So I'm going to post a link, and it's one of my all-time favorite videos about attentional awareness. I'm not going to spoil it for you. Please watch it. It'll give you a better idea of how attention can impact memory formation. The problem is that there are some problems with this. Sometimes information can just skip over those first 2 stages and automatically enter long-term memory. In addition to that, we can't focus on all of the sensory information, so we have to select how does that process operate. That's one of the problems. And then, of course, the last problem, and this is a very serious problem, and we're going to discuss it in just a second here, is that the nature of short-term or working memory is very, very complex. So the next model of memory that we're going to look at is the model made by Baddeley. So Baddeley is huge in memory research, and he proposed a working memory model to understand how memory formation occurs. So this is the working memory model, and it's very complex. So if you don't get it on the first go-around, that's fine. I didn't fully get it until grad school. So the idea of the working memory model is that you have this whole big plate of working memory, and it only gives you so much space. So everything goes into working memory and it kind of floats around in various areas. And what we find is that the brain has different forms of working memory. You have information processing for audition and for vision. So audition is, I'm speaking about auditory capability here. But before it even gets there, we have to talk about the first step. So the first step is much like, here, let me go back. Okay, so the first step is much like here. Oh, come on, sorry. Much like here, where you have the external events, the sensory input, and it moves over to working memory, right? Well, we're going to ignore sensory memory, and we're going to go straight into the working memory. So the sensory input goes into the working memory. The first location it goes is what's known as the episodic buffer. So the episodic buffer is basically what enables you to ignore all of the extraneous details. You know, when you're sitting in a classroom and you're taking notes, you are not paying attention to what's on the walls beside you or what's behind you, or even oftentimes what your classmates are doing. What you're paying attention to is the teacher, the lecture notes, ideally, right? But the episodic buffer determines what you pay attention to. Now, the episodic buffer pushes the information into the central executive. The central executive directs that focus. And it splits off. Now that's the interesting part where we see that there are different types of memory within working memory. So we see the auditory system and the visual system operating independently, such to the point where you can actively engage in two different tasks, both the auditory and the visual forms of memory. And by doing this, you can perform two tasks simultaneously. Still difficult because you only have so much working memory resources, but you can put the resources differentially into these two groups. So the information goes either into auditory rehearsal or to the visuospatial sketchpad, and then it gets sent right back to the central executive, where it directs focus again, and over time this iterative process results in the formation of long-term memories. Now, once the long-term memory is there, it doesn't just sit there and do nothing. You actually have to pull it back into the working memory format. So think about it this way. Your working memory is like a computer monitor, and you're only allowed so much space to do things. So you can minimize things, but you can only multitask so much. You can only include so many open windows at one time. Well, when you input the data, that's that sensory input. And then you decide where it goes, you decide where to save it, or what to throw away. So you decide, oh, that's just a note I took down, I'm going to delete it. So that's the episodic buffer. Then you decide where to save all the information. That's the central executive. So you might save your songs over in your iTunes folder and your pictures over in your pictures folder. And then by doing that saving, it moves into long-term memory. But you can't just let it sit on your hard drive. You have to pull it back onto your monitor or your working memory to be able to use the information. So one of the really interesting things about working memory, and I'm going to leave it here, this is going to be the end of the lecture. One of the really interesting things about working memory is that we each have a different working memory size. Everybody has largely predetermined, primarily genetic working memory. So the general idea is that somebody can remember 7 plus or minus 2 things at one time without having moving it over to the long-term memory. So your working memory can, generally speaking, handle about 7 plus or minus 2 items. This is part of why phone numbers are a perfect length at 7 numbers. We're going to talk later on about chunking and some ways that you can get around some of the issues, some of the limitations of working memory. But the idea here is that you have a monitor that can be huge or can be small, and it's largely genetically set. And what we see is that working memory is also highly correlated with intelligence quotient, or your IQ. So generally speaking, people that have higher IQs have a greater working memory. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So if someone is really, really smart, part of the reason that they are really, really smart is because they have so much more space to work with to be able to draw conclusions. So instead of saying, oh, wait, and having to go through a bunch of files and figure out how these numbers add up, they can pull them both up on the same screen and figure out how the numbers add up really quickly. So that's why working memory is a good proxy for understanding intelligence as well. However, you can get around a small working memory with good planning, and it's not necessary for success to have a high-level working memory. So that's it for the day. Next time we're going to get a little bit more in depth. We're going to discuss encoding, which is that first stage of memory that's getting the information into the brain. And then we're going to go a little bit more into memory in the next couple of lectures. So ask me some questions, and let's get this going. Y'all have a great day. See you next time.